Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dives. We're diving into a really fascinating area of psychology today,
Oh, yeah.
developmental pathogenesis,
Hmm.
which sounds kind of intimidating.
It does sound a little jargony.
Yeah, but don't worry, we're going to break it all down.
We will.
So we're working with a psychology textbook here,
Right.
a whole unit that looks at how mental health challenges develop over a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So like from childhood to adulthood.
Exactly. Across the whole lifespan.
You were talking biological stuff,
Yeah.
psychosocial stuff,
Oh.
socio-cultural stuff.
It's all connected.
It's all connected. Our mission today,
Okay.
to equip you
Yes.
with a clear understanding of all these different factors
Mm.
that can impact mental well-being.
Makes sense.
And I have a feeling we're going to find some surprising stuff along the way.
Oh, I'm sure we will. It's always more interesting than folks might think.
Right. Not just a dry textbook.
No, not at all.
So where do we even begin with this massive topic?
Well, the risk factor model is a good starting point.
Okay, risk factor model. What's that all about?
Well, think of it like a detective's toolkit
Okay.
for understanding why some folks are more vulnerable to mental health challenges than others.
So it's not as simple as saying, oh, you have anxiety because of this one thing.
Nope. It's way more complex than that.
Okay, so tell me more about this risk factor model. How does it work?
So it encourages us to think in terms of layers.
Layers. Okay, I like that.
Yeah. So first, you've got the individual level.
Like what kind of stuff?
Things like specific genes a person might have inherited.
Like if your parents had anxiety, you're more likely to.
Well, it's not quite that direct, but yes, certain genes can make someone more susceptible to stress or anxiety.
Okay, so genes are part of that individual layer.
Yeah.
What else?
Also, personality traits.
Like if you're naturally more introverted or extroverted?
Yes, things like that, how you tend to react to the world.
Okay, so that's one layer, individual stuff.
Then we move out to the family layer.
Family dynamics, that makes sense.
Exactly. So think about a parent's mental health, family dynamics.
Like if there's a lot of conflict or if someone's being scapegoated.
Exactly, or even if there's abuse or neglect going on.
Wow, so that family environment can really impact someone's vulnerability.
Big time.
Okay, so we've got individual and family. What's the next layer?
We zoom out even further to the community level.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly.
Right.
Here we're talking about things like poverty, discrimination, lack of access to resources.
I can see how all of that would create stress.
Absolutely. And that stress can make individuals and families even more vulnerable.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Totally. It's this interplay of individual, family, A and D community that shapes someone's path.
This is giving me major nature versus nurture vibes.
Oh, yeah, that classic debate.
Like how much is our mental health determined by our genes and how much is it shaped by our experiences?
Right. But the risk factor model helps us move past that simple versus.
So it's not one or the other.
Nope, it's both. And it's about how those forces interact.
Give me an example.
Okay, so imagine someone's genes make them super sensitive to stress, but they grow up in a loving, supportive family.
So they have that buffer.
Exactly. Those genes might never really express themselves,
Wow.
but if that same person with those sensitive genes
Uh-huh.
grows up in a chaotic, stressful family environment,
Oh, I see.
that can trigger those genes to activate.
So it's the combination of the genes and the experience.
That's the key. That's what we mean by interaction.
So it's not like our genes determine our destiny.
Not at all.
It's more like they set the stage, but our experiences write the script.
I love that analogy. It's this complex dance between biology and experience.
My brain is already buzzing with all these connections.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. Okay, so let's dig into some specifics.
Okay.
Starting with the biology.
Right.
Like how do our brains and bodies even play into all of this?
Well, one of the coolest areas is this thing called gene-environment interaction.
We already talked about that a little bit.
We did, but there's so much more to uncover.
Okay, I'm ready.
So remember, we all inherit this genetic blueprint from our parents.
Our genotype.
You got it. But those genes don't just automatically determine everything about us.
Yeah.
It's more about how those genes actually express themselves in real life.
And that's the phenotype.
Right, what we actually observe.
So it's like the genotype is the recipe and the phenotype is the actual cake.
A delicious analogy. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
Because the environment can actually influence how our genes work.
Wait, seriously?
Yep. There's this fascinating study about the serotonin transporter gene.
What does that gene do?
Well, it's involved in mood regulation.
So it's related to things like depression and anxiety.
Exactly. And researchers found that there are actually different versions of this gene.
Whoa, wait, so you can have different versions of the same gene?
Yep. like different editions of a book, slight variations.
Okay, that's blowing my mind. So back to the study.
Right. So they looked at people with different versions of this gene, and they found something really interesting. Only the people who had a specific gene variation, A and D, had also experienced maltreatment as children, were significantly more likely to have depression as adults.
Wait, so it wasn't the gene alone that caused depression. It was the combination of the gene A and D, the experience.
Exactly. That's what we mean by interaction.
It's like the gene created a vulnerability, but it took that environmental trigger to actually activate it.
A perfect way to put it. We call this a diathesis stress model.
Diathesis stress. Okay, I'm going to write that down.
It basically means that we might have a predisposition to something, but it often takes a specific kind of stressor to actually bring it out.
So it's not all doom and gloom if you inherit a gene that makes you susceptible to something.
Not at all. It just means we need to be aware of those vulnerabilities and take steps to create supportive environments.
That makes so much sense. Okay,
Oh.
so genes aren't destiny.
Definitely not.
It's more like they set the stage, but our experiences shape the plot.
I love that. But remember, genes are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. What else do we need to consider?
We also have to factor in the incredible world of the neuroendocrine system.
Oh, that sounds complicated.
It can be, but think about it like this. How does your body react when you're stressed out?
Oh, gosh, my heart starts racing.
Yeah.
I get all sweaty. My mind goes a mile a minute.
Exactly. That's your nervous system kicking into gear.
It's like my body's preparing for battle.
Exactly. It's that fight or flight response.
But I feel like some people are way more sensitive to stress than others.
And that's where the neuroendocrine system comes in, specifically a system called the HPA axis.
The HPA axis. Okay, I'm taking notes.
Think of it like the communication highway between your brain and your adrenal glands.
So the ones that pump out adrenaline, right?
You got it. So when you perceive a threat,
Like a big deadline at work.
yeah, or a scary situation, your brain sends a signal to your adrenal glands, and bam, they release a bunch of stress hormones like cortisol.
So that rush of energy I feel when I'm stressed is cortisol.
You got it. It's your body gearing up to deal with the threat.
Okay, that makes sense. But you were saying that some people's HPA axis is more reactive than others.
Exactly. And that's due to a whole bunch of factors: genetics, early experiences, even personality.
Some people are just wired to be more sensitive to stress.
It seems that way. And that can make them more vulnerable to mental health challenges down the road.
So it's not just about the stressful event itself, it's about how our body reacts to it.
Precisely. It's this interplay of biology and environment.
I'm starting to see that everything is connected.
It really is, and that's what makes this whole area so fascinating.
It is. Okay, so we've got genes and this HPA axis thing. What other biological factors are at play?
Well, even before we're born, certain things can set the stage for our mental health.
Like what?
Consider low birth weight,
Yeah.
often linked to socioeconomic disadvantage. It can actually be a risk factor for later mental health challenges.
Really? So even something that happens during pregnancy can have a long-term impact?
It can. And it's not just low birth weight. Think about things like early physical deprivation.
Like not getting enough food or sleep as a baby.
Exactly. Especially during those critical developmental years. It can hinder healthy brain development.
This is making me realize how crucial it is to create nurturing environments for kids right from the start.
It's fundamental. And there's also this fascinating thing called the Goldilocks principle when it comes to stimulation.
Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Like the fairy tale.
Yep. It's this idea that both too little and too much stimulation can be bad for development.
So it's got to be just right.
You got it.
Yeah.
Like Goldilocks and the porridge.
I love that analogy. Okay, so we've talked a lot about biology so far, but where do relationships fit into all of this?
That's the perfect segue into our next area, psychosocial factors. We're talking about how those early relationships and experiences shape who we become.
I'm so ready to dive into that world.
Yeah.
It's always fascinated me how much our early relationships can impact our mental health.
Me too. And it all starts with those very first relationships we have.
With our parents or caregivers.
Exactly. We're talking about parental deprivation and separation.
Okay, so what happens when children don't have that consistent, loving bond with their caregivers?
Well, for healthy development, kids need that secure attachment.
I've heard of attachment theory. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. John Bowlby developed this theory that emphasizes the importance of early attachment experiences.
Right. It's like those early bonds create a blueprint for how we approach all relationships throughout our lives.
Exactly. It shapes our ability to trust, regulate our emotions, even our sense of self-worth.
So if a child has a secure attachment, they're more likely to develop healthy relationships later on.
Absolutely. They tend to feel more confident in connecting with others, and they're better able to cope with challenges.
But what happens when those early bonds are disrupted or insecure?
That's when things can get tricky. Children who experience insecure attachment might develop a sense of mistrust or anxiety in relationships.
I can see how that would make it hard to form healthy connections.
It can. And the effects can linger into adulthood.
So even as adults, our early attachment experience can still be influencing us.
Absolutely. It's powerful stuff.
Wow. This is really making me think about the importance of creating those secure, loving environments for kids.
It's foundational. And it's not just about preventing negative outcomes. It's about setting kids up to thrive.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about attachment.
Mhm.
What other psychosocial factors are at play here?
Well, let's talk about trauma.
Ooh, that's a heavy one.
It is, but it's also incredibly important to understand.
Okay.
So we use the term psychic trauma to describe any experience that overwhelms a child's coping mechanisms and leaves lasting psychological wounds.
So we're talking about things like abuse, neglect, witnessing violence.
Exactly. Those are all examples of events that can have a profound impact on a child's development.
Because their brains are still developing.
Right. They're not equipped to handle that level of stress and fear.
And what's really scary is that those wounds can get reactivated later in life by stressors that might seem totally unrelated.
Absolutely. It's like those traumatic memories get stored in the body and they can resurface when we least expect it.
So it's not just about the event itself. It's about the long-term psychological and even physical impact it has.
You got it. Trauma can fundamentally change how we experience the world and ourselves.
This is making me realize how crucial it is to support children who have experienced trauma.
It's essential. And not just children, but adults, too, who might be carrying those wounds from their past.
Absolutely. We need to create safe and supportive environments where people can heal and process those experiences.
I couldn't agree more. Speaking of impactful experiences, let's talk about another major psychosocial factor: parental mental illness.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can imagine how challenging it must be for a child to grow up with a parent who's struggling with their mental health.
It definitely presents unique challenges.
Like what?
Well, first of all, there's the genetic component.
Like if a parent has depression, their child might be more likely to develop depression too.
Right, there's that genetic predisposition.
But it's not just about genes, right?
No, it's also about the environment that a parent's mental illness creates.
So it's like a double whammy. You inherit the genes A and D,
Yeah.
you inherit a challenging environment.
Exactly. For example, if a parent has severe depression, they might struggle to be consistently attentive or provide the structure and support a child needs.
That makes sense. Kids need predictability and stability.
They do. And when those things are lacking, it can increase their risk of developing their own emotional and behavioral difficulties.
It's like a domino effect, where one challenge creates a cascade of others.
I like that analogy. And this brings us to another fascinating topic that I think will resonate with a lot of our listeners:
Okay, hit me with it.
parenting style.
Parenting styles.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm always curious about this.
I bet. Everyone has opinions about parenting.
Right. Everyone's an expert.
Exactly. But there's actually a lot of research on this.
Like what kind of research?
Well, there's this really well-known framework developed by Diana Baumrind.
I've heard that name before.
She identified 4 main parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, indulgent, and neglectful, uninvolved.
Whoa, those are some mouthful names. Can you break them down for me?
Absolutely. Let's start with authoritative parenting.
Okay, authoritative. What's that all about?
This style is often considered the most supportive
Why is that?
because it blends warmth and structure.
Okay, so it's not just about being strict or being lenient, it's about finding that balance.
Exactly. Authoritative parents set clear limits and expectations.
So the kids know what's expected of them.
Right. But they're also warm and loving towards their children.
So there's that emotional connection too.
Yes. They encourage open communication, they respect their children's opinions, and they even involve them in decision-making.
So it's about giving kids a voice.
Exactly. It's about empowering them.
That makes a lot of sense. I can see how that style would foster healthy development.
It does. Children raised by authoritative parents tend to be more independent, self-confident, and they have better social skills.
It's like they've been given the tools they need to thrive.
Right. They've learned how to navigate the world effectively.
Okay, what about the other styles? Starting with authoritarian.
Okay. Authoritarian parenting is all about rules and obedience.
So it's more strict.
Much more. They tend to be less warm and more controlling.
So it's more about my way or the highway.
Exactly. There's less room for flexibility or negotiation.
And how does that style impact kids?
Well, unfortunately, Children raised in this type of environment are statistically more likely to be anxious, withdrawn, and have lower self-esteem.
Because they haven't had the chance to develop their own sense of agency.
Right. They're used to following directions without question.
Okay, that makes sense. What about permissive indulgent?
Okay, this style is basically the opposite of authoritarian.
So they're the cool parents.
Yeah, they're super loving and affectionate, but
Right.
they're also really lenient. They avoid setting limits or enforcing rules.
So the kids can pretty much do whatever they want.
Pretty much. And while that might seem fun and carefree in the short term,
Right.
it can actually lead to some challenges later on. Well, these kids might struggle with self-control, respecting authority, and delaying gratification.
So they haven't learned those important life skills.
Exactly. And that can lead to problems in school relationships and even their own mental health.
So it's not really doing them any favors in the long run.
Nope. It's about finding that balance between warmth and structure.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And then there's neglectful uninvolved, which sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It does. These parents are emotionally detached and uninvolved in their children's lives.
So they're basically absent.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
They might provide for their children's basic needs like food and shelter, but they don't offer much in the way of affection, support, or guidance.
Wow, that sounds incredibly damaging.
It is. Children raised in this type of environment often struggle to form secure attachments. They have low self-esteem, and they're at a much higher risk for all sorts of problems.
That's really sad. It highlights just how crucial that parental involvement is.
Absolutely. Those early relationships lay the foundation for everything.
This whole conversation about parenting styles is so fascinating. It's making me reflect on my own childhood and how my parents' approach shaped who I am today.
It's natural to connect these concepts to our own lives.
Yeah, and it makes me realize that there's no one right way to parent.
Right. Every family is different and every child is different.
But it's good to be aware of these different styles and their potential impact.
Exactly. It helps us make more conscious choices as parents.
Okay, so we've talked about parental deprivation, trauma, parenting styles. What else is going on in this psychosocial realm?
Well, communication is a big one.
Communication, like how parents talk to their kids.
Yes. Healthy communication is absolutely essential within families.
Okay, so what did that look like?
It means creating a space where everyone feels safe to express their thoughts and feelings openly and honestly.
So no shutting down emotions.
Exactly. It's about validating each other's experiences and actively listening.
What happens when communication breaks down?
Well, imagine a family where the parents are always busy or preoccupied.
So the kids don't feel heard.
Exactly. Or a family where there's a lot of yelling and conflict.
That would make it hard to express yourself.
It would. And over time, that lack of open communication can really erode trust and connection within the family.
And that can have a ripple effect on all the relationships within the family.
Absolutely. It can create a lot of distance and misunderstanding.
So it's not just about the presence or absence of communication, but the quality of that communication that really matters.
You nailed it. And then, of course, we can't forget about the impact of disrupted family relationships.
Disrupted, you mean things like divorce?
Yes. While it's important to acknowledge that not all children of divorce experience negative outcomes, research shows that it can be a significant stressor for kids.
Yeah, it's a huge life change.
It is. Think about all the adjustments they have to make, switching schools, maybe even going back and forth between two households.
It's a lot to handle.
It is.
Yeah.
And especially if the divorce is particularly acrimonious,
Mm-hmm.
children might feel a sense of insecurity or even guilt.
Like it's somehow their fault.
Exactly. And that can have a lasting impact on their sense of self-worth.
This is heavy stuff.
It is. But there's also a lot of resilience in kids.
So it's not inevitable that they'll have problems.
Not at all. But it's important to provide support and understanding during these transitions.
That makes sense. So we've talked about all these intense internal family dynamics.
We have, but we can't forget about the bigger picture.
Okay, so what's the next layer?
The socio-cultural layer. We're going to zoom out and explore how the broader context of society shapes our mental health and well-being.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. It's like understanding how all these systems and structures impact us.
Exactly. We're talking about things like cultural norms, societal expectations, economic conditions.
The stuff that we often take for granted.
Yes. But these factors can have a profound influence on our mental health.
I'm ready to dive into that world.
All right, let's start by acknowledging that we inherit not just genes from our families, but also sociocultural patterns.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. We're born into a pre-existing set of beliefs, values, and behaviors that are passed down through generations.
So it's like we're inheriting a culture.
Exactly. And that culture shapes how we see the world interact with others and even how we cope with challenges.
I can see how that would play a huge role in our mental health.
It does, and it's important to remember that culture is constantly evolving.
Right, it's not static.
Exactly. So those patterns we inherit can be helpful.
Like providing a sense of belonging and tradition.
Yes, but they can also be harmful.
Like if they promote unhealthy behaviors or create stigma around mental health.
Exactly. So it's about being critical of those inherited patterns and recognizing that we have the power to change them.
So it's not just about what we inherit, but about what we choose to create.
I love that. It's about agency and empowerment.
Okay, this is getting me fired up.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how those socio-cultural influences play out.
Well, let's start with social roles.
Social roles, like what kind of roles?
Every society has certain expectations for how people should behave based on their gender, their age, their occupation, and so on.
Like the classic example of women being expected to be nurturing and men being expected to be strong.
Exactly. Those are gender roles. But we also have roles associated with being a student, a parent, a boss, an employee, and so on.
And these roles can be helpful, right?
They can provide a sense of structure and identity, but they can also be incredibly restrictive and even harmful if they're too rigid or if they conflict with our own sense of self.
So if someone feels pressured to conform to a role that doesn't feel authentic to them, it could lead to a lot of stress and anxiety.
Absolutely. And that's where mental health challenges can arise.
So it's not just about the roles themselves, but about how well those roles align with who we truly are.
Exactly. And then there are what we call pathogenic societal influences.
Pathogenic, that sounds intense.
It is. These are basically broader social forces that can increase the risk of mental health challenges.
Give me some examples.
Well, one major factor is low socioeconomic status.
Poverty.
Right. Poverty and lack of opportunity create immense stress and make it nearly impossible to meet even basic needs.
It's hard to focus on your mental health when you're worried about where your next meal is coming from.
Exactly. And then there are what we call disorder engendering social roles.
Disorder engendering. Okay, what does that mean?
These are roles that inherently expose individuals to a high risk of trauma or distress.
Like soldiers who are constantly facing danger.
Exactly. Or first responders, healthcare workers, anyone who's regularly exposed to trauma.
It makes you realize that sometimes society itself can create the conditions that contribute to mental health problems.
That's such an important point. It's not always about individual weakness or failing.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about the systems and structures that are failing us.
Absolutely. And then we can't forget about the impact of social change and uncertainty.
Especially in today's world.
Right. Everything is changing so rapidly.
It's like we're constantly trying to keep up, but the goalposts keep moving.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly stressful and overwhelming.
So it's not just about the changes themselves, but about our ability to adapt to those changes.
Right. And some people are more adaptable than others.
That makes sense. This is all giving me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's complex stuff, but it's also incredibly important to understand.
Okay, so we've explored biological factors, psychosocial factors, and now socio-cultural factors. Feels like we've covered so much ground.
We have, and it's all interconnected.
Right. It's like this intricate web of influences that shape our mental health.
Exactly. And understanding that web is the first step toward creating more supportive environments for ourselves and others.
I like that. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to delve into some specific examples of how these developmental influences play out in real life.
Okay, I'm ready for some real-world application.
Let's do it.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
When we left off, we were talking about how even these big picture things like social change and all the uncertainty in the world can really impact how we're feeling mentally.
It's true. It's not just our own little personal bubble. It's
Yeah.
the whole world out there.
Right. It's those larger currents we're all swimming in.
Exactly. And thinking about those big currents, it makes me wonder how understanding all this stuff we've been talking about, this developmental pathogenesis, how can we actually use it to make a difference?
That's the key question, isn't it?
It is, because it's great to have all this knowledge,
Uh-huh.
but what good is it if we don't actually do anything with it?
Right. We don't want it to just stay in the textbook.
Exactly. So how can understanding developmental pathogenesis actually help us make the world a better place?
Well, for one thing, it can help us be more understanding and compassionate people.
Okay, I like that. Tell me more.
Think about it. If we know that someone might have a genetic predisposition that makes them more sensitive to stress,
Uh-huh.
we can be more patient with them.
Yeah, instead of thinking they're overreacting.
Exactly. We can recognize that their response might be rooted in their biology. It's not just a choice they're making.
Right. It's not like they're choosing to be stressed out.
Exactly. And the same thing applies to understanding the long-term effects of early experiences.
Like if someone went through a really rough childhood.
Right. We might need to approach them with a little extra sensitivity.
Because those experiences have shaped who they are today.
Exactly. It's about meeting people where they are.
I like that.
Yeah.
And this understanding can also inform how we parent, right?
Absolutely. Knowing about the different parenting styles and their potential effects can help us make more conscious choices about how we interact with our kids.
It's like we're not just blindly following what our parents did or reacting emotionally.
Right. We can actually be more intentional about how we're shaping our children's development.
I keep thinking back to that authoritative style we talked about, warm and structured.
It's a great model. But of course, nobody's perfect.
Oh, definitely not.
Right. So it's more about being aware of our own tendencies as parents and making a conscious effort to create that kind of nurturing and structured environment.
So it's about being thoughtful and intentional.
Exactly. And this awareness can extend beyond our families, too.
How so?
Well, think about the link between poverty and mental health.
Yeah, we talked about that.
If we really grasp how much poverty can impact someone's well-being, we might be more motivated to support policies that address economic disparities.
Right. It's not just a personal issue. It's a societal issue.
Exactly. By creating more just and equitable communities, we can actually prevent a lot of suffering.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's about taking a proactive approach rather than just waiting for problems to arise.
Exactly. It's about investing in things like mental health services in schools, support programs for parents, early childhood interventions, all those things that can make a big difference.
It's about building a stronger foundation for everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all making so much sense, but I'm also wondering, how can we apply this knowledge to specific fields?
Yeah.
Like beyond just being better people?
Oh, there are so many applications. Think about educators, for example.
Teachers.
Right. They can use this knowledge to create more trauma-informed classrooms.
What does that mean, trauma-informed?
It means being sensitive to the needs of students who have experienced trauma.
Because a lot of kids are dealing with stuff that we might not even know about.
Exactly. And if teachers are aware of those potential challenges, they can create a more supportive and understanding learning environment.
That's so important. Schools should be a safe haven for kids.
I agree. And what about healthcare providers?
Doctors, nurses, therapists.
Yep. They can use this knowledge to understand the root causes of their patients' struggles.
So instead of just treating the symptoms?
They can look at the whole person, their social context, their early experiences, everything that might be contributing to their current situation.
That's a much more holistic approach.
It is, and it can lead to more effective and compassionate care.
I love that. And then there are policymakers.
Right. They can use this knowledge to craft better policies that take into account all these different risk and protective factors.
So we're talking about policies that support families, promote early childhood development, address poverty.
All of that. It's about creating a society that supports mental well-being from the ground up.
This is blowing my mind. It feels like we're starting to see the bigger picture of how developmental pathogenesis can be applied to make a real difference.
It's a powerful lens, isn't it?
It is. It's like a roadmap that can guide us towards a more effective and compassionate approach to mental health.
I love that analogy. It's about understanding the journey and charting a course towards a brighter future.
Speaking of journeys, I'm ready to dive back into those specific influences we were talking about.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's start with those biological influences and see how they play out in real-world examples.
All right, let's revisit that HPA axis, our stress response system.
The one that pumps out cortisol.
You got it. And it's a perfect example of how our biology and our environment work together.
Give me an example.
Well, research suggests that experiencing a lot of stress early in life,
Like a difficult childhood.
exactly, it can actually change how the HPA axis develops.
So it's like those early experiences are literally shaping our brains.
They are, and those changes can make the HPA axis more reactive to stress later on.
So even adults, we're still carrying those early experiences with us.
We are, and that heightened reactivity can make people more vulnerable to things like anxiety disorders, depression, even physical health problems.
Because stress affects everything.
It does, and here's where it gets even more interesting. Scientists have discovered that certain gene variations can make people more susceptible to those negative effects of early life stress.
So it's like a double whammy. The genes and the environment.
Exactly. It's that interaction we keep talking about.
Right. It's never just nature or nurture. It's always both.
Always. And this really highlights why personalized approaches to mental health care are so important.
Personalized, what do you mean?
Well, it means recognizing that what works for one person might not work for another.
Because we all have different genes, different experiences.
Exactly. So instead of trying to fit everyone into the same box,
Right.
we need to tailor treatments and interventions to meet individual needs.
That makes a lot of sense. And this understanding of gene-environment interactions can also inform how we think about prevention, right?
Absolutely. If we know certain individuals are more vulnerable because of their genes or their early experiences, we can provide extra support and resources to help them build resilience.
I love that. It's about empowering people and giving them the tools they need to thrive.
Exactly. And it's about creating communities that are sensitive and responsive to the needs of all their members.
It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
That's the dream.
Okay, we've talked about genes and stress responses. Now let's shift gears and talk about those psychosocial influences.
All right, let's do it.
I'm really fascinated by how our early relationships and experiences, especially those early bonds we form, can shape our mental health.
Me too. And there's no better place to start than with John Bowlby and his attachment theory.
The one that says those early caregiver relationships are super important.
Exactly. Because those first bonds we form, they lay the foundation for all our future relationships.
It's like those early interactions are shaping our expectations about what relationships should be like.
They are. And they also shape our ability to trust others, regulate our own emotions, even our sense of self-worth.
So if a child has a secure attachment to their caregiver,
Uh-huh.
they're more likely to develop healthy relationships later in life.
Exactly. They tend to have a stronger sense of self-worth. They feel more confident in connecting with others, and they're better able to cope with challenges.
But what happens when those early bonds are disrupted or insecure?
Things can get a lot more complicated. Children who experience insecure attachment might develop a sense of mistrust or anxiety in relationships.
Because they haven't learned to trust that their needs will be met.
Right. They might have this underlying fear of abandonment or rejection.
And they can make it really hard to open up and be vulnerable in relationships.
It can. And these patterns can, unfortunately, persist into adulthood.
So even as adults, our early attachment experiences can still be influencing us.
Absolutely. It's like we're carrying those early blueprints with us.
That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if there's anything we can do to heal from those early attachment wounds.
That's a great question. And the good news is, yes, there is.
Oh, good.
Therapy can be incredibly helpful for folks who want to understand their attachment style and develop healthier ways of relating to others.
So it's not like we're doomed to repeat those same patterns forever.
Not at all. With awareness, effort, and support, change, possible.
That's encouraging. Okay, so we've talked about attachment. Let's move on to another big one, trauma.
Okay, trauma. It's a heavy topic, but an important one.
Yeah, we touched on it earlier, but I feel like we could spend a whole episode just talking about trauma.
We definitely could. It's such a complex and multifaceted issue.
It is. But for now, let's focus on how childhood trauma in particular can impact mental health.
Sounds good. Remember, we use the term trauma to describe any event that overwhelms our ability to cope.
Like those big T traumas we talked about before.
Right? Things like abuse, neglect, witnessing violence.
Those are the ones that come to mind.
Yes. But it's important to remember that trauma can also be more subtle.
Like what?
Well, it could be something like experiencing a serious illness or injury, or witnessing a car accident, or even being bullied.
So it's not just about those big dramatic events. It can be anything that feels overwhelming or terrifying to a child.
Exactly. And the impact of trauma can be devastating and long-lasting.
Tell me more about that impact.
Well, traumatic experiences can actually disrupt brain development.
Whoa, seriously?
They can also alter those stress response systems we talked about earlier, making someone more sensitive to stress later in life.
So it's like trauma is literally rewiring the brain.
In a way, yes. And these changes can lead to a whole range of mental health challenges, including PTSD, anxiety, depression, substance abuse.
It's like trauma creates this vulnerability that can last for years.
It can. And what's even more challenging is that those traumatic memories can get stored in the body.
In the body, what do you mean?
It means that trauma can manifest as physical symptoms, like chronic pain, digestive issues, sleep disturbances.
So it's not just in our heads.
Nope, it affects our whole being.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I've definitely noticed that connection between my mental and physical health.
It's a powerful connection. And this really underscores the need for a holistic approach to trauma recovery.
Holistic, like mind-body connection kind of stuff.
Exactly. We need to address not only the psychological symptoms of trauma, but also the physical manifestations.
Because it's all connected.
It is. And it's about creating safe and supportive environments where people can process their trauma at their own pace, build resilience, and ultimately reclaim their lives.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
This makes me think about those parenting styles again.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, we talked about authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, indulgent, neglectful, uninvolved. I'm wondering, could those styles also play a role in how a child copes with trauma?
Absolutely. Some parenting styles can actually exacerbate the effects of trauma.
Make them worse?
Yeah, while others can act as a buffer, offering protection and support.
Okay, I'm really curious about this. So are there certain parenting styles that make it harder for kids to cope with trauma?
Yes, unfortunately there are. For example, let's consider an authoritarian parenting style.
The one with lots of strict rules and not a lot of warmth.
Exactly. That kind of environment can make children feel afraid to express their emotions or ask for help.
Like they're walking on eggshells all the time.
Right. They're constantly worried about making a mistake or disappointing their parents.
So if those children experience a traumatic event, they might be even less likely to reach out for support or share what happened.
Exactly. They might try to keep it all bottled up inside.
Which can make things even worse.
It can. It can lead to all sorts of problems down the road.
So it's like that authoritarian style is creating an extra layer of difficulty on top of the trauma.
Exactly. But on the flip side, there are parenting styles that can actually protect children from some of those negative effects of trauma.
Okay, tell me about those.
Well, the authoritative parenting style, that blend of warmth and structure, it can be a powerful buffer against the impact of trauma.
Why is that?
Because those parents are supportive and loving while also setting clear boundaries.
So there's that balance again.
Yes. They encourage open communication, they respect their children's opinions, and they create an environment where kids feel safe to express themselves.
So even if those children experience a traumatic event, they have that strong foundation of support to draw upon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They know they're loved unconditionally, they know they can talk to their parents about anything, and they've already developed some coping skills that can help them navigate those difficult situations.
This is giving me hope. It highlights how important it is to create those secure, loving connections early on.
It is. And it's not just about preventing trauma, it's about creating a foundation of resilience.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about attachment trauma and parenting styles. Are there any other key psychosocial factors that we should consider?
Yes. We can't forget about the importance of social support.
I've always heard that having a good support system is crucial for mental health.
And it's true. Research shows that people who feel connected to others are less likely to experience depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges.
It's like having a safety net.
Exactly. But why is that?
I'm curious too. What makes social connections so powerful?
Well, for one thing, it gives us a sense of belonging.
Like we're part of something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. It reminds us that we're not alone, that there are people who care about us and want to support us.
And that can make a huge difference when we're going through tough times.
It can. Knowing that we have people we can turn to for help can make challenges feel less overwhelming.
It's like sharing the burden makes it lighter.
Yes. And social support is also a great way to cope with stress.
Because when we're stressed out, we tend to isolate ourselves.
Right. We might withdraw from our friends and family.
But that's actually the opposite of what we should be doing.
Exactly. Connecting with others, even if it's just for a few minutes, can make a big difference in how we're feeling.
So reach out to a friend. Call your mom.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be about talking about your problems. It could just be about spending time with people who make you feel good.
Like watching a movie together, going for a walk.
Exactly. Anything that helps you feel connected and supported.
This is making me realize how important it is to nurture those relationships in our lives.
It's crucial. Social connection is like a superpower for mental well-being.
I love that. It's true. Those connections can really lift us up when we're feeling down.
They can. And they can also help us celebrate the good times.
Because joy is always better when it's shared.
Absolutely. So let's make a pact to prioritize those connections in our lives.
Deal. Okay, so we've talked about attachment trauma, parenting styles, social support. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground in this psychosocial realm.
We have, and it's all interconnected.
It is. It's like this intricate web that shapes our mental health.
A web that's constantly evolving.
Because our relationships change, we have new experiences.
Right. It's a dynamic process.
And that's actually kind of encouraging, right?
It is, because it means we're not stuck with the same web forever.
We can make changes, strengthen those connections, build new ones.
Exactly. We have the power to shape our own web to make it stronger and more resilient.
That's a beautiful image. Okay, I'm feeling inspired now. Let's zoom back out to those sociocultural factors.
Sounds good.
I'm eager to understand more about how society itself can contribute to or hinder our mental health.
It's a fascinating area, and it's all about understanding the larger context in which we live our
The
lives.
big picture stuff.
Exactly. The culture, the systems, the norms, all those things that shape our experiences.
Okay, so remind me again, what exactly do we mean by sociocultural influences?
We're talking about things like cultural norms, societal expectations, economic conditions, access to resources.
The stuff that's often invisible but has a huge impact.
Exactly. And these factors can have a profound impact on our mental health.
Okay, I'm ready for some examples.
All right, well, let's start with cultural norms.
Okay, cultural norms, what are those?
Basically, every culture has its own set of beliefs, values, and behaviors that shape how people view the world, interact with each other, and cope with challenges.
Like how some cultures are more individualistic while others are more collectivist.
Exactly. Those are classic examples. And these cultural differences can influence how people express emotions, seek help, even how they define mental illness itself.
So what's considered normal in one culture might be seen as abnormal in another.
Absolutely. And that can have a huge impact on how mental health challenges are understood, diagnosed, and treated.
It makes me realize how important it is to be culturally sensitive in our approach to mental health care.
It's essential. We can't just assume that what works for one person will automatically work for another.
Because everyone's coming from a different cultural background.
Right. And those differences matter.
So it's about being respectful of diversity
Yeah.
and recognizing that there are many different ways of experiencing and coping with mental health challenges.
Exactly. And this cultural sensitivity isn't just important for therapists or doctors.
Right.
It's important for all of us.
It's about being aware of our own biases and approaching others with curiosity and openness.
I love that. Now let's shift our focus to another key socio-cultural factor, societal expectations.
Societal expectations.
Basically, every society has certain expectations for how people should behave based on their gender, their age, their socioeconomic status, and so on.
It's like we're all assigned certain roles to play.
In a way, yes. And those roles can be helpful.
How so?
Well, they can provide a sense of structure and purpose.
Like knowing what's expected of
Right. But they can also be incredibly restrictive and even harmful if they're too rigid or unrealistic.
So it's about finding that balance again.
Exactly. And I'm thinking about gender roles, for example.
Yeah, the pressure to conform to traditional masculine or feminine norms can be really intense.
It can, and it can contribute to a whole range of mental health challenges, including body image issues, eating disorders, depression, anxiety.
It's like society's constantly sending us messages about who we should be, how we should look, how we should behave.
It is. And when we don't measure up,
We feel like we're not good enough.
exactly. And that can be incredibly damaging to our self-esteem and our overall mental well-being.
So how do we push back against those expectations that can be so harmful?
Well, it starts with awareness. We need to recognize that these expectations are socially constructed, not biologically determined.
So they're not set in stone.
Exactly. They can be challenged, questioned, and ultimately changed.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice.
We do. We don't have to blindly accept those societal expectations.
We can create our own paths.
Exactly. And we can support others in doing the same.
I love that. It's about celebrating diversity and creating a world where everyone feels free to be themselves.
That's the goal. Okay, now let's move on to another significant sociocultural factor, economic conditions.
Economic conditions. We talked about poverty earlier.
We did, but it's worth diving a little deeper.
Because it's such a huge issue.
It is. Research consistently shows that poverty is a major risk factor for mental illness.
Why is that?
Well, poverty creates immense stress, and it makes it incredibly difficult to meet basic needs, like food, housing, healthcare.
It's like living in survival mode all the time.
Exactly, and that chronic stress can take a huge toll on both our mental and physical health.
So it's not just about lacking money. It's about lacking resources, opportunity, security.
You got it. And it's often about being trapped in a system that makes it incredibly difficult to break free from those limitations.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And this really highlights the importance of addressing poverty, not just as an economic issue, but as a public health issue.
We need to create a society that supports everyone's well-being.
Exactly. We need economic policies and social safety nets that create opportunities for people to thrive, not just survive.
It's about investing in people, not just profits.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, we've talked about cultural norms, societal expectations, and economic conditions. What other key sociocultural factors should we consider?
One that feels really relevant these days is the political climate,
Oh, absolutely. It's hard to ignore the impact of politics on our mental health.
because it feels like the world is so divided right now.
It does. And that division can create a lot of stress and anxiety.
For sure. I've definitely noticed that people are more on edge these days.
It makes sense. When we feel like our values are under attack or that the future is uncertain, it can create a sense of fear and instability.
And that can make it really hard to cope with everything else that's going on in our lives.
It can, so it's important to find ways to manage that political stress.
Like what?
Well, staying informed is important.
Yeah, we need to know what's going on.
Right. But it's also important to set boundaries and limit our exposure to negative news and social media.
Because it's easy to get sucked into that 24-hour news cycle and feel constantly bombarded with negativity.
Exactly. And that can really take a toll on our mental health.
So it's about finding that balance between staying informed and protecting ourselves.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to prioritize self-care during these times.
Self-care, like taking a break from the news.
Yes. And also things like exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones.
Anything that helps us feel grounded and recharged.
Exactly. And it's about actively cultivating hope, even when things feel uncertain.
Hope. But how can we be hopeful when the world feels so messed up?
Well, it's about focusing on the things we can control.
Like our own actions, our own attitudes.
Exactly. And it's about connecting with others who share our values and working together to create positive change.
It's about remembering that we're not alone in this.
Exactly. We're all in this together.
This whole conversation about socio-cultural influences has been incredibly eye-opening. It really highlights how much our mental health is connected to the health of our communities and the world around us.
I'm so glad you're getting that from this deep dive. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that creating a more just and equitable world is essential for everyone's well-being.
It's about shifting from me to we.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we all have a stake in each other's well-being.
Okay, we've covered so much ground today. We've explored biological influences, psychosocial influences, and now sociocultural influences. It feels like we've woven this intricate tapestry of understanding.
We have, and it's beautiful, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this second part, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder.
Okay, what's the question?
Given everything we've learned about developmental pathogenesis so far, what is one small step you can take today to create a more supportive environment for yourself or for someone else?
I love that question. It could be something as simple as checking in on a friend, practicing self-care, or speaking out against mental health stigma.
Remember, no action is too small.
Every little bit helps.
Exactly. We'll be right back with the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more nuances of this fascinating topic and continue to unpack the complex interplay of factors that shape our mental health. Welcome back to the deep dive. In the last part, we were talking about those big picture sociocultural influences on mental health.
Right, like poverty and political climates, all that stuff.
Yeah, the heavy stuff. But I'm wondering, how do all these forces actually intersect with each other?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because it can't be as simple as just adding up the challenges, right?
Right. It's
Right.
much more nuanced than that.
Okay, so tell me more. How do these factors overlap and interact?
Well, think about it like those Venn diagrams from school.
Okay, I vaguely remember those.
You've got those overlapping circles,
Uh-huh.
and the areas where they overlap create something new entirely.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. Give me a real-world example.
All right, let's imagine someone who is a minority in a predominantly white culture.
Okay.
They're already navigating a world that might not fully reflect their experiences or values.
I can see how that could be isolating.
It can be.
Yeah.
And then add on experiences of discrimination or prejudice.
So it's not just about being different. It's about facing those systemic barriers and biases.
Exactly. And those experiences can take a real toll on someone's mental health.
It's like carrying this extra weight on your shoulders, knowing that you're not fully accepted or valued for who you are.
That's a powerful way to put it. And for folks who are facing multiple forms of oppression, that weight can feel even heavier.
Multiple forms of oppression. What do you mean by that?
Imagine being a Black woman who's also living in poverty.
Right.
You're facing racism, sexism, A&D, economic hardship, all at the same time.
That's a lot to deal with.
It is. And this intersection of multiple forms of oppression can create a perfect storm for mental health challenges.
It's like each challenge amplifies the effects of the others.
Exactly. It's not additive, it's exponential.
That's a really important point.
And it highlights why this idea of intersectionality needs to be front and center in how we approach mental health.
So it's not enough to just treat the symptoms. We need to understand the whole context of a person's life.
Exactly. We need a more holistic and culturally sensitive approach, recognizing the unique challenges and strengths that each person brings to the table.
This whole conversation makes me realize how much work we still need to do to create a truly just and equitable world where everyone has a real chance to thrive.
It's a journey, but I'm hopeful. We're having these conversations, awareness is growing, and people are working to make a difference.
That's true. Awareness is always the first step.
Mm.
And speaking of action, let's revisit those things we can do to create more supportive environments.
Yeah. What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, we talked about breaking down stigma and normalizing mental health challenges. That feels like a good place to start.
It's essential. We need to create a culture where people feel safe to talk about their struggles and get help without feeling ashamed or embarrassed.
Like it's no big deal to go to therapy or take medication for your mental health.
Exactly. Because right now, that stigma is one of the biggest barriers to getting help.
It makes people feel like they have to suffer in silence.
Way. So how do we break down that stigma?
I think education is key. We need to learn about mental illness, challenge our own biases, and start talking more openly and honestly about mental health.
I love that. It's about treating mental health challenges with the same compassion and understanding that we would offer anyone facing a health crisis.
Exactly. And we can also advocate for changes in our systems and policies.
Yes. Like what?
We can support increased funding for mental health services, access to affordable housing and healthcare laws that protect against discrimination.
All of those things are so important. It's about using our voices to create a more just and equitable world.
Because our individual actions matter, but so do those larger systemic changes.
Absolutely. It's a both-hand situation.
This has been an incredible journey exploring all those intricate factors that shape our mental well-being.
It really has. We've covered so much ground.
From those tiny genes to those massive societal structures, it's all connected.
It is. And that's the beauty of developmental pathogenesis. It helps us see the bigger picture.
And it gives us hope, right?
Absolutely. Because understanding is the first step towards change.
And change is always possible.
It is, even when things feel really challenging.
Well said. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of developmental pathogenesis.
It's been a pleasure sharing these ideas with you.
We hope you've learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to take action.
Remember, every little bit counts.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep nurturing your own mental well-being.